Thank you, Steve. Thank you, everybody. It's wonderful to be back in sunny Vancouver. I was just in warm and wonderful Winnipeg, standing at Portage and Main, the windiest intersection in Canada. So I have had a lot of wonderful experiences over the past week. So thank you. An offer I always make now, not only for the presentation I'm giving, but for the Bonobo presentation, if you would like to take that home and show it to your children, as long as they're over 18. Just send me some email, so you got my contact information on the very first slide. And I will be happy to send you, not a PDF, but I'll send you the PowerPoint presentation. In this one, I'm going to be referencing another talk I gave in 2011. And if you go look at that and you think that looks interesting, I'd be happy to also share the PowerPoint with you. Most of the time these days, I am talking about, I don't remember how Steve described it, but my word for it is weird. So I give the weird talks. And that's because I'm passionate about it. And I make connections with Agile and a number of things that I feel are interesting. And if you make that same connection and you also think they're interesting, well, I'm so happy if you would like to have the PowerPoint and then you give that presentation yourself. I don't have time to go to all the workplaces, all of the schools, all of the families. And I think most of the things I'm talking about apply in all of those environments. So I'm happy to give you the PowerPoint. You can change it so that it fits your environment. So send me some email. If you don't want the PowerPoint, that's okay. If you just have a question, even though I'm going to be here all day today, if we don't get a chance to talk and you think of a question that you have, please also send me some email. I love to talk about Agile, patterns, retrospectives, the change process, and how your brain works. So this is a talk about resiliency. How many of you are doing some kind of Agile development? Almost everybody in the room. Exactly. And when you see all of the benefits of Agile, you're convinced that perhaps this might apply to something beyond software. How many of you sign up for any of the discussion lists that have to do with Agile? There's a Scrum list, there's an XP list, there's an Agile list, where there are lots of discussions about how is this working for you and what are the difficulties you face. Are you on any of those lists? Yeah, and one of the things that comes up often is, can you take this and apply it in other settings? So I know people who are building houses, planning weddings, raising their children, using Scrum. In fact, I did read recently, someone said, if you can't Scrum it, you shouldn't do it. So there are broader applications than just software for all of these, well, whatever it is that we like, that we embrace about Agile. So this is an extension of Agile into a very, very different environment. So in 2011, I gave the closing keynote. I don't know how this happens, but I wind up giving the closing keynote for a lot of conferences. I think most people know now that I do give weird talks, and that seems to keep people around a little longer, maybe delay that flight, so they want to hear, well, wow, I wonder what weird talk Linda is going to give now. And so I'm sort of the anchor or the bookend for a lot of Agile conferences. And in 2011, I gave a kind of an unusual talk about something that I called the Agile mindset. And I know the talk is still out there. Again, I'll be happy to send you the slides so you don't have to write all of that down, or you can just Google Linda Rising, Agile Mindset, and I think this will pop up, or I've given it a number of times. You can watch it online. And the talk was okay. I thought it was pretty good. I thought it went well, and it had strange consequences. So when I started talking about the research in Agile Mindset, which focuses on these two, well, attitudes or points of view, people began extending it to areas I hadn't anticipated. So we'll see if that happens. This is a little reminder of what went on in that talk, both for those of you who have already seen it and for those of you who have not, because I'm going to build on it, and let's make sure that you kind of remember what was going on at the time. So this is about research in psychology, and it has to do with our attitude toward intelligence. Wait, let's take a poll here. How many smart people in the room? 3, thank you. 3 people, 3 smart people. So when we even think about that, smart, or any ability, any talent, we tend to fall into one or the other of 2 camps. So let's look at number 1, intelligence. Well, you know, that's something you're born with. You have it or not. You know, you can learn some new things, of course, but basically your intelligence, your smartness, you can't really do a whole lot about that. Some people say in the US that you have it or you don't. We're looking for a natural talent. It's fixed. So that's one attitude, one camp, one point of view. Number 2 says, well, of course, no matter what I do, I am limited by what I had when I was born. I'm limited by what my parents provided for me, the environment where I grew up. I'm a musician. I know I'll never be a famous composer or performer. I'll never be Beethoven. I am a computer scientist. I know I'll never make great contributions no matter how hard I work. I know I have my limits, as we all do, but I do know that whatever those talents and abilities, whatever intelligence or smartness I have, I can learn and I can get better. I've gone back to graduate school so many times, and in the US, every time you do that, you have to take something called the GRE, Graduate Records Exam. And my brother was an expert in testing, and at one time he told me, well, Linda, those are standardized tests. They're designed so that whatever your stage in life or your education, the score that you get on those tests is going to not really change much. And I said, well, how is that possible? Because over the time, in between my taking of those GRE standardized tests, I've gotten degrees, I've worked in industry, I've taught at university. Surely I should be able to raise my score, especially in math and science, because that's where I spent my career. So I'm here to tell you that my brother was wrong. I could see my test scores going up. In fact, they all went up, even in English, fine and liberal arts areas where I'm not an expert, where I have an interest or a passion around, for example, music, but I hadn't studied, hadn't gotten any degrees, but my scores definitely went up. So I have argued with my brother about that and many other things. So maybe the people who designed those tests, they were trying to, with a fixed mindset, measure something like, how tall are you? With the idea that once they measure that, after you have reached adulthood, that's it. You're not going to change. So this is not only about being smart, about intelligence, it has to do with any talent or ability. Music, art, golf. You have it or you don't, that's fixed. Or yes, you're limited, but you can always get better, you can improve, you can grow. So I hope you're thinking now, how do I look at that? Maybe what you think at this point is, well, you know, there are some areas where I lean in the direction of attitude number 1. And there are other areas where I lean in the attitude of viewpoint 2. Is that what most of you are thinking? You have a little bit of both? Yeah. So the research shows that that's true for all of us. We go back and forth, but the research also shows that we have a tendency to lean more heavily in one direction than another. So that we tend most of the time toward the fixed mindset, or I like to call number 2 agile. So yeah, we go back and forth, but we definitely lean in one direction or another. And what I explained in the talk is there's an extensive research program that's been going on now for decades. So this is not some new startling, maybe tomorrow we'll change our minds kind of information. This has been around for a long time. In fact, I'm so disturbed by the fact that I didn't know about it. And I'm even more disturbed by the fact that teachers and parents don't seem to know about it. That now I really care about trying to explain what the research says and to offer that PowerPoint so that you can explain it to others who can't be here today. Because the research shows that since you have that tendency to choose one over the other, even though, yes, you do go back and forth, that you tend to have either the fixed or the agile mindset, that changes everything. So this is a little summary. We don't have time to go through all the research. A little summary of what the implications are for holding primarily number 1, the fixed mindset, or number 2, the agile mindset. So let's look at this list. If you hold primarily the fixed mindset, that means that you think all talent, all ability, all intelligence is fixed like height. That was the example I gave earlier. There's nothing you can do about it. Whereas if you have the agile mindset, you believe, no, wait a minute. No, I believe that you can grow it. It's like a muscle. So you have probably figured out by now that I'm incredibly old. And you would be right. In fact, maybe when Steve said she has a PhD in computer science, you might have been saying to yourself, oh my God, how is that possible? This woman must be at least 150 years old. I think I just died here. Did I lose it? I lost it. Just talking about age, and I feel like I'm ready to go. You know, when I first went to school, I can speak louder. He's going to help me out here. When I first went to school, I got my first bachelor's degree. Am I okay, or what should I do? There wasn't a field called computer science. In fact, we were sitting around in a circle with a campfire, beating out messages on rock. What should I do? Okay. Oh, my battery has died. Oh, God. That's it. There goes the old ticker. Okay. All right, we'll keep going. My first degree is in chemistry. And then after a while, I went back to school and I got degrees in mathematics. Didn't quite finish that PhD. And it wasn't until much later that I got a master's in computer science. And then my goal at one point was to go back and finish my PhD by 50. Finish by 50. So I just made it. I defended my thesis 1 month before my 50th birthday, and that was 22 years ago. Let's see, can you do the math? 22 years. Okay, so I'm going to do that. It's like a transplant. Thank you. Okay. So can we turn it down? All right, good. Okay. Yeah. Is that good? Okay. Can you hear me in the back now? All right, good. So that's my definition of agility. It's not being afraid. How many of you came into the room today pondering some decision? Should I quit this job? Should I go back to school? Should I? We're always, aren't we, debating about life decisions, paths to take? And how many of you in the midst of that internal debate said, oh no, I don't think I can change jobs at my time of life. After all, I'm now 35. I'm terribly old, so I don't think I have the stamina to go back to school or to do whatever it is that you wanted to do. No, I'm just much too old. So the research around aging is pretty clear. It shows that if you think people who are old are incapable of contributing anything, you remember that movie about where they said everybody over 35 should be ground up and made into hamburgers? Can't remember the name of that movie. But Soylent Green, yeah. That attitude leads to premature aging. People who believe that old people are worthless and should be ground into hamburgers or killed or whatever, they tend to show signs of aging earlier. And they also die earlier. Whereas those people who believe, oh no, old people are cool. Old people can do wonderful things. As those people age, they show fewer signs of aging and they live longer. So here's my gift to you. Will you let me be your role model? Will you? Okay, so this is what 72 looks like. 72 gets to travel around the world. 72 gets to hang out with amazing people like you. 72 keeps learning. So if you will let me be your role model, when you are 72, you'll be awesome. You're already pretty good, aren't you? Yeah. So if you're agile, you believe that, no, intelligence, capabilities of any kind, they're like muscles. And the message now is very clear. It's so hopeful. I love it. That if you work those muscles, if you lift weights, you can build bone. That if you continue to learn, you can increase connections between the neurons in your brain. The agile mindset, in other words, is the truth. that all your abilities are growable, improvable, learnable. The people who hold the fixed mindset are wrong. So just that information often is enough to shift it for you. If you have a tendency or if you lean toward the fixed mindset, that information is sometimes enough to let you move to the agile side. Because the implications are pretty clear. That the next one, for instance, goals. If you have the fixed mindset, your goal is to always look good. You never want to make mistakes. You never want to look like you don't know what you're doing, because that's a clear indication that you don't have it. Whereas the goal for somebody with the agile mindset is to say, yeah, well, it's about learning, and that means I might make mistakes, and that means I might not always look good. But my goal is to improve, is to grow that talent, that intelligence, or that ability. And on the road to improvement, I'm not always going to look perfect. I'm going to try things out. I'm going to experiment. Can you see why I began to line up that agile mindset with agile software development? Challenges for those with a fixed mindset, don't go there. Because you might not be able to overcome that, you might not look good, and then everybody would begin to believe that you don't have it. Whereas those on the agile side say, challenge, oh yeah, bring it on. I want that, because that will help me improve. And that's my goal, is getting better. Failure, we don't want to fail if we have the fixed mindset. Because that's a clear indication that we don't have it. Failure on the other side said, I can learn from failure. That helps me do something so that now I'm on my path to improvement. Effort. I just heard an interview with Stephen Hawking. Do you know who he is? Stephen Hawking, the most famous productive living physicist, or cosmologist, as he calls himself. And he said, you know, when I was a student at Oxford, I never studied. I never worked. Because the culture there was, if you have to work, that must mean you're not very smart. If you have to struggle to solve those problems, that must mean that you don't have any talent or ability in physics. If you're a natural, if you're talented, then it should be easy. You should just be able to perform without effort. He said, it wasn't until I got to Cambridge, after he'd finished his PhD or DPhil, said it wasn't until later in life that I realized that working is fun. It's what I do all the time now. Because you probably know Stephen Hawking has ALS. It's a degenerative disease. He can only move a little tiny muscle under his left eye. And Google has provided an incredible environment so that with that little muscle alone, he can speak through and write in an environment that lets him communicate his amazing thoughts and ideas with the rest of us. So that's what he does all the time now. He works and twitches that little eye muscle. So he realized finally, effort is good. That's how you get better. And then here's the connection to the talk today. That ultimately, even if you want to avoid it, we're all going to have failures. We're all going to run into things where we're not going to look so good. And the attitude of somebody with a fixed mindset is, oh, I guess this is proof I don't have it. I often talk to young women at university who are struggling with difficult subjects, And they come up after I give the talk on the mindset and they say, thank you. I was ready to give up. I was ready to pack it up and go home because I thought I didn't have it. They had the fixed mindset. And since they had to struggle, and since they always didn't get everything perfectly, correctly, wonderfully, they thought that must be a sign that they should go elsewhere and try something else. So if maybe you've been going through that, that might indicate that you have the fixed mindset. That's not an indication that you should move on to something else. That just means you should work a little harder or try some new strategies, or it's not an identity. It's a chance to learn about yourself. So people with the Agile mindset, when they fall down, they get up again. When they don't do so well, they try another approach. When faced with overwhelming challenges, instead of saying, I guess I don't have it, I guess I'll go home, they bounce back. And the psychologists label that resiliency. And that's the ultimate reward of the Agile mindset, is being able to overcome those challenges and face them and bounce back like a rubber ball to be resilient. And that's what we're about today, is we want you all not only to be agile, we want you to be resilient. So all the research is interesting because in it they try to encourage one mindset or the other so they can look at observable, measurable results from holding the mindset. So they have techniques, so they have ways of encouraging one mindset or the other. And it doesn't really take a whole lot. And so that's a good thing, because what we know is that at the end of this talk, you're going to be more agile than when you walked in the door this morning. Just hearing about the research is often enough to move people in that direction. So small manipulations, small things that we say to one another, small things we tell our children can have enormous impact on the mindset that we hold. And so that's the kind of email I get all the time. Linda, I have a bright little girl and I'm afraid that she is really going in the fixed direction. What can I do to encourage her to be more agile? Bright little girls have the most fixed mindset on the planet. And when they run into challenges, they cave. And that's what happens to them either as they transition to junior high, or as they graduate from high school, or sometimes as they get to that first job. It happens at different points, but those bright little girls who've always been successful, who have been told all along, oh, you're so smart, which encourages the fixed mindset, they cave in, and we lose them. That's why I'm looking at the small percentage of women in this room. We need to do something about that. So the email says, what can I say? What can I tell my children? What can I tell my colleagues? What can I tell my spouse? What can I tell myself? I see that I might have the fixed mindset. So now the question that I am involved in is, I see all this research. Is there anything we can do about that? We want to move people in the agile direction. Can we train people? Can we have a little class? Are there experiments of any kind that show, yes, you can take somebody who has a fixed mindset and by process of education or exercise, or what can we do? Can they be moved in the agile direction? And the answer is yes. So I don't have time to give this talk. It's another one, a follow-on, that goes into all of the experiments, all the research around different kinds of people who tend toward the fixed mindset. And that includes young women, very fixed. Members of stereotyped groups, minorities, who have been told all their lives, you'll never make it. who hear that message from the culture around them. You're not quite as good as the rest of us. And they've had that message delivered to them constantly, day after day, all their lives. And now they believe it. It's pretty solid and deep. Is there any hope there? Can we move those people in those stereotyped and those cohorts that exhibit the fixed mindset? Can we move them in the Agile direction? Otherwise, we lose them. We lose their contributions. We know that teams are better when they're diverse. And the pushback I always get from organizations is, we can't find talented women, talented members of minority stereotype groups. They're just not out there. So let's do what we can to grow those contributions, and that will make us all better. So how can we do that? So the research is pretty clear. Sometimes just providing a little information is enough to begin the process. And what's especially encouraging is that when there is training, when there is education, when there's information available, the people who are helped the most are young women and members of stereotyped groups. They make the most statistically measurable improvement in math and science, particularly after they know just a little bit about the Agile mindset. And they come to believe, there's a very famous quote from one of these studies. A young gentleman who's black is saying to the researcher, "You mean I don't have to be stupid?" So here we are. I know some people are uncomfortable talking about the military. I think somehow that doesn't apply to what we do. And the history is pretty clear. That the structures of organizations that we have today came from the military. This is the largest, oldest form of human organization that we have. It's our best model for how groups of people should operate. Large groups, smaller groups. It's what the military has been doing, not just the US military, but around the globe. It's how they've been organizing themselves. It's how they've been making decisions for thousands of years. So we should definitely pay attention. And we also know that the military faces incredible struggles. When they talk about a retrospective, and that's where we got the idea of a retrospective, by the way, was from the military. They have always done retrospectives. When they look at what worked well, what should we do differently, they're talking about lives. So much more serious concern than number of defects or customer interaction. Not that those aren't important, but these are life critical. So powerful motivation for trying to improve. So I know you don't have time to write all that down. Remember, I'll send you the slides, and I think these will be available somewhere on our website. Yes, so that you don't have to write all of that down. So the announcement was made in 2009 by a high-level individual in the military. He said, we have got a lot of problems here. And they had been looking at the work of Carol Dweck and a whole host of other psychologists that were talking about resiliency and agility and saying we have to be more resilient, more agile because of the overwhelming difficulties we face. And I have numbers for those. We'll look at them in a minute. You can go to this website. You can't see everything. Some of it is password protected, but a lot of it is open. You can freely download PowerPoint presentations or pieces of training modules. You can use them yourself, because I've been going through some of them. I definitely found things where I thought, I need work on that. Let me just take that and go through some of the exercises and see if I can improve. So A lot of this is just open information. Go ahead and use it. The word resilience was chosen because of the connection to Agile mindset. We know that that's the ultimate goal. That's the desired characteristic for the military, is we want people to be able to go through, well, think about what people in the military go through. Want somebody to be able to be in a horrible situation and watch your friend be killed. You want to have to go back again and again, repeated deployments, and still say whole or sane or able to function. That's ultimate resilience. So if we watch what's going on in this huge experiment, the largest social experiment ever conducted, if we watch, then surely we can apply some of those lessons to our own organizations, where we don't have to necessarily deal with mud and blood and repeated deployments through horrible situations. If it works for them, maybe there's something there that will work for us. So this is the official definition the military is using for resilience: the capacity to adapt successfully in the presence of risk and adversity. Is that what you face? Risk and adversity? Yeah. So one of the psychologists who's involved in this is Martin Seligman. Although when you look at the source of all the different modules online, everyone contributed. There are psychologists from multiple domains. I just found that Seligman's research is kind of interesting because he looked at something called learned helplessness. That in his experiments, he's done them with rats and mice and dogs and people. He put them in a situation with some kind of annoying activity. It was either a really loud noise or an electric shock. And there were three groups. So the control group that got no annoying disturbance of any kind. There was the group that got the loud noise or the electric shock and was unable to do anything about it. Had no control over the loud noise or the electric shock. And then the third group had a dial or a switch or some way of either adjusting the volume or the intensity of the shock, or could turn it off completely. So they had the same problem in the environment, but they had a sense of control. I can do something about it. And then when those three groups were then transported to another situation with the same annoying either shock or noise, what he observed that in the control group, when there was something provided like a button or a dial, they would immediately try to manipulate that dial or control to try to turn down the noise or the electric shock or turn it off. And so did the group that had had some control, but in that group that had already been, I guess we could say, trained, that had learned that they had no control. They sat in the new environment and did nothing. So when I heard about this research, I immediately thought of one company. It seemed to me like the guys were coming to work singing that song, you know, away we go. Maybe you've never been in an environment like that. Been on so many, Ed Jordan used to call those death marches. Hopeless projects. Massive oh, what am I saying? This is Canada. You don't do that here. You're sane. You don't run projects with massive amounts of overtime, do you? You don't run projects by eliminating all vacation time, do you? No. So maybe you can have some empathy for the poor people in the United States who go through this all the time. In fact, in that company, I was brought in to do a retrospective. Oh, wait a minute, let me ask you a question. Why would somebody call me, at the time I was living in Phoenix, Arizona, to go all the way across the country to Boston, which is where this company was, to do a retrospective? Why can't they do their own retrospectives? Why would they bring me in? Would they do that because they said, wow, we have had so much success, and we'd like to learn a little bit more about that? Is that why you suppose? What do you think? Anybody have an idea? Why would they do that? They have a closed mindset. No, it's probably more likely that they've had a massive failure. And what are they looking for? They're looking for ways to improve. Why do they want to do a retrospective after a massive failure? Yes, they want to know who's responsible. Who's responsible? Who can we blame for this so that we can cut off their heads? Yes, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. So in an environment like that, I think what we get is this same sense of learned helplessness that we saw with the rats and the dogs and the people who were wired up or put in the box with the loud noise, is that after a while people feel there's nothing I can do. In fact, talking to people on that team, I said, why don't you go somewhere else? And what comes out is fixed mindset. Oh, I don't think it's any better anywhere else. I have a friend who works at another company. It's exactly the same there. And I don't know, my skills are so out of date. I don't think I could find, it takes so much energy to find another job. I have to get my resume up to date. That's learned helplessness. That's been caused by the environment, just like Seligman did with the rats and the dogs. He did notice a very interesting thing, though, that in that group that tended to give up, the group that had no control, there was a little chunk of that group. It varies from experiment to experiment, so I'm just going to say about a third. So that's worth paying attention to. About a third of those people never gave up. I don't know if you have the fortitude to read about people who survived concentration camps or other horrible situations where they survived. There are always some who survive, who seem very resilient. Wouldn't it be worthwhile to learn how did they do that? How do you survive a horrible situation? Well, either a series of death marches in projects or unheard of conditions, and come out resilient. So that's what Seligman did. He concentrated on what it is that those people do. And then what we'll see is the military now tries to train people to do this. He said, one thing we notice about those people is that when they talk about the environment, whether it's the series of death marches or the horrible conditions that the military face, they seem to look at it as, well, this is the way it is now. Yes, this is the way it is now, but it's not going to last forever. It's temporary. Well, yeah, this is the way it is now here, but that's not the way it is everywhere. So it's local. And as bad as it is, I even talked to a gentleman in Winnipeg who was very discouraged about his environment, and I said, I believe, and there's research that will back me up, that there's always something you can do, some small change you can make. And since this is a complex adaptive system, that means you have the ability to influence it, even in a small way. So they believe that it's changeable. So those resilient people who survived a situation where they essentially had no control over the electric shock or the loud noise, when they talked about it, I often wonder if Seligman interviewed the rats and the dogs. Well, tell me, how did you survive that horrible condition? Whoa, 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 whoa. So I'm thinking that maybe these are only the people. So we don't know about the rats and the dogs. We're guessing. But here's what the people say when interviewed. As they talk about it, as though, yeah, it's bad now, but it's not going to be that way forever. Yeah, it's really bad, but it's not bad everywhere. And they were always doing some small thing, just some small thing. On the other side, that bigger group, the 2/3 that gave up, who fell into the hole of learned helplessness, those people had the opposite viewpoint. Kind of like the engineer I talked to at that company on the East Coast who said, no, this is going to be this way forever. I'll just be here till I retire. I'm just hanging on. Oh my, I hear that a lot these days. I'm just hanging on. I got 9 more years and then I can retire. If I can just make it another 5 years, then I can retire. It's never going to end. It's permanent. So that's the other side. It's permanent, and it's out of my control, and it's everywhere. Everybody is like this. There's no need for me to even think about looking at other companies because this is the way it is everywhere. And those are the people who have given up. I had 2 friends from another company who were fired, and one of them was exactly that way. He said, oh, I never was very good anyway. I never got good performance reviews. My manager didn't like me. And so I don't know whether it's even worthwhile putting my resume together. I probably wouldn't find another job. The economy is bad. There's no hope for recovery. Right now, I just don't feel very good. And then my other friend said, yeah, I know this is not a good thing, but I'm going to go home. I'm going to start working on my resume. I think maybe if I start working, I can network. I have some friends that get together for lunch, and they talk about new opportunities that are in the area. And maybe I'll use this time, I'll take a little course in this new programming language I've been wanting to learn. And ultimately, of course, the optimistic person who said this is not going to last forever, who took advantage of the opportunity, who was proactive and agile. It took him a while, but he did find a job. My other friend, this was 10 years ago, has still not found a job. He sits at home in his bathrobe and he says, oh, I'm writing code for open source projects. I said, that's nice. So explanatory style. So when Seligman and others began to identify characteristics that people seem to have who are resilient, a question came up, well, can we teach this? So they began some small experiments. And one of them was at the University of Pennsylvania, where they worked with depressed and severely anxious children that had some learning disorders, and also with the parents, trying not only to provide education, training for these individuals in these techniques, but also to teach them to coach and work with others so that they could help each other, so that parents and teachers could support each other with children who were having difficult challenges. So this experiment began and now is spreading. It was initially just a small experiment at the University of Pennsylvania, and now there are several sites around the world, and they've got very good results. And it was this information that led the military to say, can we do something like that? So the program is called Comprehensive Soldier Fitness. It's run by a woman, yes, yes, who's a brigadier general, yes. So she's in charge of this. It has several pieces. It's in the early stages. They're trying to be agile about this and grow it slowly. So an individual soldier goes online and takes a series of tests. And in those tests come a profile, series of scores that all give information to the individual soldier about areas that might need attention. And then that soldier can go out and select appropriate modules, and on his or her own time can run through them, and then comes back in a year for follow-up assessment. All the data from these interactions is kept, but it is all anonymous. So what we have as a result of what's been going on so far is to see that people are improving on those initial tests. That is, that they're getting better in all of the different areas that lead to resilience. But the most powerful thing to come out of this experiment are what the individual soldiers are saying. So subjective evaluation about their experiences. And at the same time, those who have some authority over small teams, so that's the sergeant level in the Army, they are given a special kind of training, information, exactly like the program at University of Pennsylvania. They're taught how to coach. They're sort of train the trainer situation, so that once a soldier has been through a module on a particular area, the sergeant is now in a position to reinforce that, to encourage it, to set expectations. The sergeant tracks the progress of all the people who are under his or her command. So the environment is also being improved to grow resiliency. So this is all individual. Individual soldiers select. And you can go online. I know I can't even read that, so I imagine you can't. But again, I'll send you the slides. The individual modules are there, so that maybe you see one that looks interesting to you. You can download it and go through the exercises. So here's the real problem. In the United States right now, we can't seem to keep our hands off the rest of the world. So we're here, we're over there. And so what we do in a situation like that is we take an individual soldier. That individual soldier might be sent for a deployment in one of those areas, comes home, and just a short time later, sent back again. Comes home, sent back again. Over and over. It's only when they cannot go another time do they say, okay, enough. And what we see is something that really wasn't talked about until long after the Vietnam War, wasn't even really identified, called post-traumatic stress syndrome. So it's overwhelming now. And it's a very expensive disorder to treat. So the numbers say, this is from 2011, so it's old information. Every 3 months, 10,000 veterans lined up for treatment. I don't know about you, but that seems like a lot of people. So far to date, more than 200,000 people have been diagnosed and are under treatment, and that treatment is expensive. So when people look at the cost of this experiment in training resilience, you say, well, let's compare that to the cost of treating post-traumatic stress. And this one, very disturbing. In 2010, 22 committed suicide every day. So the cost in human suffering, how do you measure that? So yeah, it's an expensive experiment, as I already said, the largest social experiment ever. Yeah, it's expensive, but so is this. So I don't know, is it a leap? I don't know how many of you are suffering from post-traumatic stress. How bad was that last project? Was it a death march? Wait, no, I forgot. I'm in Canada. You don't have that kind of thing here. You don't have post-traumatic stress because, of course, you don't have terrorist incidents, do you? Do you? And as I mentioned, I only see dysfunctional teams. Maybe it's me. But I thought a lot of this work looked like it could help. So I started crawling through it and I said, what can I hand you that maybe you could then find useful? So there is one module that I thought maybe I might have time to lead you through. So this particular module has to do with the kind of problem I talked about, the two engineers who were laid off and their very different attitudes, and that one of them did find another job and the other one is still sitting in his bathrobe writing open source code. So it begins with a model that's been around for a long time. It was developed by a psychologist called Ellis. It's called the ABCD model. So A stands for an activating event. Something happens. B, that's how you look at the world, what your beliefs, so B is for belief, what your beliefs are about how the world operates, and in particular, all of the parts of the environment that touch that event that we're going to focus on. So we got activating event, beliefs. C, the consequences for you, that's what we care about, is for you, how you feel and what you do. And we'll skip D for the minute, because here's the problem. Most of us think, erroneously, that when something happens and we have some sort of feeling as a reaction, or we do something as a reaction, that it was caused by the event. When in reality, it was caused by that intermediate B, or our beliefs about the event. If you remember my story about the two engineers who were laid off, they both had the same experience. They were in a company and they were both laid off, but boy, they saw it differently. They experienced it differently, they felt differently, because they had different beliefs about that event, about what happened. One said, oh, my manager's always been out to get me. And watch out. We get caught up because we tend to think that our beliefs are truth. That's how the environment is. So it takes a lot of work to pull those apart, to say, no, that is not the environment. That's me. That's what I believe about the environment. Let's just look at what happened and get that B part out of there. So that's the part D of the model, which says, let's see if we can work on what's going on in B and see if by improving that, we can improve the C part, or the consequences, and thereby improve our agility or our resiliency. So the exercises, and we don't have time to go through one, but they run a little scenario, and then they say, all right, suppose this happened to you. And how would you feel and what would you do? And then in small groups, they begin to pull it apart. So it's very common for a soldier who's in combat to Skype with his family. And in one of the scenarios, you say, suppose you're Skyping with your family and your wife is not there. You're talking to your children, or maybe your parents are there, but your wife's not there for some reason. And everyone says, oh, well, she had to, and they offer up an explanation. How do you feel, and what do you think? And they all jump to the conclusion that, oh, she must be cheating on me. I'm sure she's cheating on me. I know she doesn't love me anymore. I thought that when I headed out for deployment. It's easy to do that. And instead, let's just look at what happened and see how much of that is tied to what you believe about yourself, what you believe about your marriage, what you believe about people and how they behave. So they start to tear apart those beliefs in stage B, and they pull out some pretty deep, firmly held ideas about how the world operates. And those are called icebergs, because usually you have to go way down in order to pull up all of those. Those are called iceberg beliefs. And then they say, let's talk about that one. And some of those beliefs have to do with the way the world operates and the way people operate. So there are a series of questions that they ask each other in discussion. This one gets a lot of attention. And I think it applies directly to software teams. It's a pattern from the book Fearless Change. It's called Ask for Help. And the pushback I always get on that pattern is, well, Linda, I can't use that pattern in my organization. If I don't do the whole thing, then everyone else will say, well, you either couldn't, you don't have the talent or ability or the smarts to get it done by yourself. You had to ask for a lot of help. Or you're lazy. All kinds of bad pushback in organizations for people who ask for help. It's a sign, fixed mindset, it's a sign that you don't have it. You don't have the talent or the ability or the energy or the organizational skills to get this job done. You had to ask Eugene for help, or Rebecca. And instead of realizing that that's a very good thing and that will improve the result, they're denigrated for that. That's exactly the case in the military. Because these are soldiers, after all. They're supposed to be strong. You're not supposed to ask for help. This is a core belief, not just in the military, but in many organizations, that this is a sign of weakness. You don't have it if you have to bring in others and ask for help. And I mentioned earlier, there's data to show that these experiments are working, but what's most impressive to me are the comments from individuals. And one soldier in particular, he said, yes, there is a time when I would have called somebody a really bad name if they were asking for help, especially from somebody like a professional counselor or perhaps a chaplain. And now that I've gone through the training, I realize that we're all going to need help as we go through multiple deployments. It's the people who are the strong ones who are willing to ask for it. It's a radical shift. So by going through a few modules, this particular soldier has now come full circle from saying, no, I used to denigrate people who would do this, to saying, no, I recognize now that that's a strength. That's a good thing. That's a powerful indicator of change. So I often see this on Agile teams, especially when it comes to estimation. Well, how long is this particular feature going to take? Or let's pull this item from the backlog and let's see what we're... So I now start to use this little exercise. And so let's look at this particular thing and let's do this. So this is part of the module. Let's imagine the absolute worst thing that could happen. And we have to do them in this order, by the way. What's the absolute worst thing that could happen? How would that affect how long it would take us to deliver this? Next, let's look at the absolute best scenario. And how long would that take? And sometimes I'll push them. I'll push them to be ridiculous on both the worst case and the best case. And when they're pushed, pretty soon everybody is laughing, and then I said, okay, now let's look at most likely scenario. And there's something about having gone through that little exercise that gets those things out of their system, so now we can focus on something that's more realistic. So all we have is preliminary data at this point. It is all positive. Unfortunately, the Army is more concerned about deployment than it is about running an experiment. So often what will happen is they'll set up a nice control group and a training group, and they'll have good intentions, and then in the middle of the training, there will be calls for deployment, and people will be switched from one group to another, so the data is not as good as it should be. But what is there is positive. And the most effective thing about it, as I mentioned, are what the individuals say. They're now rolling it out to everyone. So we're talking about 1 million subjects. And including not only the soldiers, but also their families, especially the children. So far, so good. All kinds of anecdotal evidence. She's standing nodding at me now. The best evidence is that now they talk about it, just like the soldier and his son, and they can say, yeah, I've learned better communication styles. He's got a handle on it. He's got a name for it. And in discussions with individual soldiers in their small groups, they can talk about it and they have a name for it. They can talk about communication styles or iceberg beliefs or the ABCD model. They have a handle on it. They can't just say, oh, we want to get better. We want to make the world a better place. We want to be happier. No, it's I have something very specific with a name that I want to work on. And of course, I read that and I said, this reminds me of patterns. The whole idea behind patterns was we're going to capture good ideas and then we're going to put them out there for you, and then you can use them and you can talk about it and you can gather around the table and you can say, I think we need a mediator in this architecture. And let's put some factories, and maybe we will send messages back and forth through the remote interface. And with a handful of names, we can describe the entire architecture, and we can also decide whether it was a good idea to do it or not, because we know what the context should be, what the resulting context should be, and we do that with names. There's a lot of research around the power of names and the ability to think about and do something about something because you have a name for it. And I know you're going to think this is a real leap, and this will be proof positive that this is a weird talk. So this is Coco the gorilla. She's over 40 years old, and all her life she has been learning sign language. And we wouldn't have known otherwise if she couldn't sign that she had feelings and that she could talk about them. If you have children or grandchildren, and if they haven't read the book Coco's Kitten, because Coco loves kittens, and she had a kitten, and unfortunately it escaped and it was run over by a passing car, And when they told Coco about it, she began to sign sad, sad. Who would have known that a gorilla had feelings or could communicate the feeling of sadness at the death of a pet? But because she has a name for it, she can say sad, sad. Right after the untimely death of Robin Williams, there was a YouTube video that went viral. It was his visit with Coco and how they had names for love, hug, like. She likes to watch old reruns of Mork and Mindy. So because there's a name, there's hope. Thanks so much for sticking with me. I appreciate it.